You're listening to a download from the outdoorstation.co.uk. Number 604.
Hello and welcome back to the longest running outdoors themed podcast in the world, where we talk on a range of subjects associated with the outdoors, walking, camping, self-powered travel, with the occasional dip into exploring other aspects of general outdoor life, which deepen our education, appreciation and understanding. And this slightly longer than normal podcast is one of the latter. When we walk through the landscapes of Scotland, across empty glens, along old drover roads, over wind-scoured hills, through the quiet remains of still-standing ghostly villages, we often talk about feeling a connection, a bond with the land, a sense of peace, of history, of something older than us moving quietly under our feet. But the truth is, when you walk through Scotland, you're not just passing through scenery, you're walking through consequences. Beneath the boots and beyond the horizon lie stories that rarely announce themselves, stories of power, fear, belief and survival. And while we may feel that connection subconsciously, through the places we love to walk and camp, it's worth remembering that, historically speaking, being poor, being remote and being a woman in Scotland was not as romantic as whimsical stories would have you believe. And it certainly wasn't safe. Which brings us, rather uncomfortably, to today's conversation. It begins with a question that sounds like the setup to a bad joke, but absolutely isn't. How do you kill a witch? The chilling answer, as it turns out, is very efficiently, very legally, and for a very long time. I'm joined today by two extraordinary women, Claire Mitchell, KC, and Zoe Venditozzi, authors of the powerful and unsettling book How to Kill a Witch. It's a title designed to stop you in your tracks, because what follows is not folklore or fairy tale, but hard, meticulously documented history. Between 1563 and 1736, Scotland carried out one of the most intense witch hunts in Europe. Nearly 4,000 people were accused, the vast majority of them women, many of whom met brutal ends through strangulation and then burning. This wasn't hysteria at the margins of society. This was misogyny, patriarchy, and religious power working hand in hand, embedded in law and enforced by the state. Claire and Zoe are also founders of the Witches of Scotland campaign, launched on International Women's Day in 2020, with three clear objectives: to secure pardons for those convicted, to obtain a formal apology from the Scottish Government, and to establish a national memorial to honour the victims. In 2022, one of those aims was realised when the then First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, issued a formal apology, an important moment, but not the end of the story. In How to Kill a Witch, they walk us, quite literally, through the entire machinery of persecution, from identification and accusation, to interrogation, pricking, torture, confession, execution and beyond. With sharp wit, controlled outrage and forensic clarity, they inhabit the minds of the persecutors, predominantly men, and expose how the patriarchy went to extraordinary lengths to silence women, not just in Scotland, but around the world. This book asks not only what happened, but why. Why Scotland? Why did it go on for so long? Why were the poor and the remote so vulnerable? And perhaps most uncomfortably of all, could it happen again? We begin today with Claire explaining the 3 objectives behind the campaign and the book itself, and from there the landscape beneath our feet begins to look very different. So settle in. This is history, but you're going to hear parallels which bring it much closer than you think. So if you're someone who walks these hills, camps in these glens, or roams Scotland in search of solitude and connection, this conversation may change how you hear the land, because history isn't just something we pass through here, it's something that's been waiting beneath our feet all along.
I want to highlight the history of women in Scotland, highlight the reasons why that happened, and to explain that was a miscarriage of justice. So I went back home and I wrote down 3 things that I wanted. I wanted a pardon for all those that had been convicted, an apology for all those that had been accused, and I wanted some kind of national memorial in order to ensure that people knew the history of women in Scotland.
To really understand how to kill a witch, you first have to understand what everyday life in Scotland actually looked like at the time. Zoe and Claire explore in the book how people lived, what they feared, and how hardship, poverty, and belief shaped daily decisions. As they guide us through life during the height of the witch trials, you'll also notice echoes of our own time, reminders that while centuries may have passed, some things about suspicion, fear, and equality never fully change. Here's Zoe.
Well, we're talking about a time in Scotland that had round about a population of about 900,000, a million people, so not huge. And out of those people, over the years that it was running, the different witch trials, there was about 4,000 people accused and about 2,500 people that were found guilty and were executed. And of them, around about 84% were women. Now, we can't be super specific because the paperwork often isn't as full and as detailed as we would like it to be. And in some cases, of course, it's missing because of the amount of time that's passed, because of environmental factors, and also sometimes there's a suspicion that people got rid of paperwork because as it passed out of sort of fashion, as it were, people were ashamed of being involved with it, or people didn't want the stigma carrying on with family names through generations.
Well, one of my favourite facts is about Scotland is the fact that we celebrate New Year was because the Protestant Church banned the celebration of Christmas. So because Christmas was banned as a celebration, people then went to the New Year in Scotland and said, right, okay, we'll celebrate the New Year. And that's why there's such a big thing about New Year in Scotland. That's why there's a big hoolie. That's why Old Lang Syne. That's why all of that stuff, because we weren't having any partying around Christmas. And goodness knows, if you thought of yourself between the 16th and 18th century in Scotland, the weather, the lifestyle that you lived, you really needed something to try and get you through those winter months. And one of the things would have been a celebration at Christmas. And when that stopped, that's why we were allowed to celebrate at the New Year.
I mean, these were days when you would go to church on a Sunday, sometimes up to 3 times on a Sunday. The minister of the area held enormous power, and the men, and it was men that worked for him, they had to show that they were involved in monitoring the spiritual wellness of the community, so people would keep an eye out for behaviours. And it wasn't so much that people would go out and they'd go, right, she's a witch, and would attack her. This was all done very legally and followed the proper rules and the proper procedure. And people, although it was hundreds of years ago, weren't so very different to how we are now. You know, like King James was incredibly educated. So this was all coming from a place of very organised, thoughtful, actually in some ways it's actually more disturbing to me, coming from a very calm place of bureaucracy almost in many ways. You know, there was an administrative angle to it. So people would come and say to the minister, oh, that woman in the street, there's a problem with her, for whatever that reason was. And yes, sometimes it was a form of retribution, or it was a way of getting land, or a way of getting money, or a way of getting out of a debt. But more often than not, it was that something bad had happened. People would say, well, that must have been caused by the devil, who is the witch here, because they're out trying to ruin our lives and make us stop believing in God or whatever. And then they would say, well, she was seen muttering as she walked away when they refused to give her money when she came knocking at the door looking for begging. Or she was seen to argue about the amount of flour that she'd been given and said that she had been sort of, ripped off. Or she's always drunk, or, whatever it was. She keeps having affairs. Or she disappears at night. Where is she going? And this is the sort of thing that would then lead people to go to the minister or one of the bailies and say, I'm suspicious about her. Then they bring her in and question her. And because she was being sleep deprived or tortured, she'd break very easily. So, and the fact was, remember that they executed them publicly. Everybody had to go along and watch the execution. So, it was part of the fabric of life for a long time. And it was a way of keeping everybody in line, like really, really effective social control.
In that period, was anyone actually safe from being accused of witchcraft, or could suspicion fall on just about anyone? And was there a particular part of society who seemed to be more vulnerable to accusation than others?
Really, anybody that was about during that 150 years could be accused as a witch. For the most part, people who were accused were more likely to be people that didn't have other folk to stick up for them. So we find a lot of people without families. We find a lot of people maybe slightly older, maybe slightly not of childbearing age. But that having been said, we also find lots of people who were married and did have children. So it's really difficult to generalise, but certainly, as you have identified, the idea of the Disney witch is so far removed from what happened in Scotland that there's really no comparison.
If you were seen to not follow things the right way, that is why there would be accusations, because people were fearful. They were going through difficult times, as Claire's already said. Life was really, really hard. So if crops failed, or your cow stopped giving milk, or your baby was ill, or your neighbour died, or whatever, people would look for a scapegoat. And the most obvious choice for that was women who were vulnerable, because A, the devil would of course see them as a rich hunting ground. B, they didn't have anybody particularly to stick up for them often. C, they didn't have any personal power. So sometimes people with power, sometimes richer people would be accused. There are cases of that. But the vast majority of the time, we're talking about vulnerable people that didn't have power. And that all sort of fed into it because, of course, when they questioned the women would generally confess. Because initially there was physical torture. And then when Scotland moved away from physical torture, they used sleep deprivation, which we now know is absolutely a form of torture. And it wouldn't take long for the accused to confess. So, of course, that's backing up the idea that they have, because the women would say whatever they needed to say to make the torture stop. So it was a kind of an unstoppable juggernaut for quite a long time in Scotland.
The average witch is the average woman in Scotland. That's the honest truth of the matter. People were accused of witchcraft for all sorts of different reasons. And as a result of that, some people were accused because their friend or daughter or other family member were brought in and they were kept awake for hours on end and delirious and being asked questions about being a witch and who was in their coven, just named family members. So if you knew somebody who'd been brought in as a witch, you could then be brought in as a witch next, because in a state of delirium, having been kept awake for days on end and asked questions, it would then transpire that your name had been mentioned and you would be brought in. So people could be brought in for absolutely no reason other than someone mentioning them. They could be brought in because somebody was accusing them of, I had a fight with that person and then 2 days later my cow stopped giving milk, she's cursed my cow. Or fishermen who went to sea and there were terrible storms, and before they went out to sea, they'd had an argument with their neighbour. Well, is their neighbour a witch? So all these accusations came from the very humdrum, difficult ways of life. And as a result, anybody could be called a witch.
During that period of history, there was only one person who could fuel this climate of suspicion and division in society. Someone who assumed he had ultimate power to create the manuals that claimed moral superiority and laid out the rules that made it clear how someone could be considered an agent of the devil. But, as you'll hear, there was also cunning behind those rules, which made it virtually impossible to prove innocence.
Well, at that time in Scotland, there was a very strong belief that the king or the queen had been put there by God. So he very much saw himself as somebody that was God's ambassador, that what he was making in the way of choices for Scotland, the way that he led Scotland, was very much with God's blessing, that he was really there as an instrument of the Lord kind of thing. But as a modern day educator, I would look at what happened with James and would think that wrapped up with that and the structure sort of philosophically and spiritually, which was of course also politically, because as Claire said, the law and the church were very close to each other at that point. He had been, when he was in the womb, his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, had been held at gunpoint. She'd been obviously taken into custody. He'd been taken away from her when he was a really small baby and then had been raised by often sort of leading men, one of whom was John Knox, who it is rumoured, not substantiated, that he actually was one of the people that wrote the initial, the Witchcraft Act, which is kind of interesting. So Knox was very, very black and white about the fact that women were inferior. That he apparently was very good to his wife and his family, and he was really very helpful with women when they sort of followed the way that he wanted the church to be. But make no doubt about it, women were inferior, not just physically, but intellectually, spiritually, and morally. And because of that inferiority, that weakness in women, the devil could much more easily take advantage of women than he could of men. So this whole idea about the devil inveigling his way into women's minds and then using women as witches to bring about the downfall of society was something that was very broadly believed. I mean, this wasn't some sort of like crackpot sort of small idea. This was something across the civilization in Scotland.
James VI wrote the book on witchcraft called Demonology, and we cover that in the book, and there's a very interesting part in it where it says, if you're good and holy enough, God will not allow you to suffer the indignities that being accused of a witch will cause you. So people received comfort from the fact that if they were doing these things and God hadn't intervened in some way to stop it, that all the more went they were doing the right thing because she was a witch. Because if she wasn't a witch, God wouldn't allow godly women to be put through this. So the mindset was such that there was no way that a woman could win in those circumstances.
Scotland didn't just dabble in witch hunts. It became in many ways the epicentre. The scale and intensity of these persecutions were extraordinary, which naturally raises the question, why was this so prevalent in Scotland? Surely other parts of England, Ireland and Wales were asking the same questions about the devil and his supposed associates. So what made Scotland different?
In England, they just didn't believe in witches in the same way that we did here, not as such a broad way. There's something about the Scottish psyche that meant they got really, really into the whole idea about witches. It just really fits Scotland. I think it's because our weather's shit. I think it's because there's people that lived really much grimmer lives. It's slightly nicer the further south you go, sort of weather-wise and sort of temperature-wise. I genuinely think that's part of it. But in England, like you're saying, there's a very, very rich theme of mythology and of ghosts and of the supernatural and of spooky stuff. There were witch accusations, but in nowhere in the same way as it was in Scotland.
As we wander through the landscapes of Scotland's past, it's important to remember that these weren't just names on a page or stories in a book. They were real people moving through real places, much like we do today when we walk the glens, climb hills or follow trails. The hills and forests that now feel peaceful and timeless were once backdrops to fear, suspicion and unimaginable danger. And in those very same landscapes where our feet still tread, the recorded stories of what happened after someone was accused take on a chilling clarity. As news spread, you can almost see the rutted, lonely roads drawing witnesses into villages, the quiet murmurs amongst the crowd, smell the wood smoke and hear the echo of chains dragged across stone floors, marking the fates that so many could not escape?
Well, first of all, what would happen is that you're right, the church would take them in and they would put them in either the back of the church hall area, or what they might do is put them in the toll booth. There are toll booths all around Scotland. People that walk around Scotland or go to small villages in Scotland will know that there are toll booths, and sometimes the people accused of witchcraft were kept in there. So initially what would happen was they would be questioned by the elders and by the minister, and they would be kept awake for days on end. During that period of time, they may well have confessed to being a witch. And in the confession, it was very common for women to say the next following few things: that they'd met with the devil, that the devil had promised them either great riches or revenge on their enemies, or had lured them in some way, that the devil had then done, I suppose, what would be described as a reverse baptism. He baptised them into his coven by putting his hand on the top of their head and the bottom of their feet, and saying all betwixt and between belonged to the devil. Then usually there would be lurid tales of the devil having sex with the woman. Again, this was a further debasement to show how far away they were from God. And as a result of people knowing that if you were accused as a witch, this was what your torturers wanted to know, both the torturers and the people being tortured knew the script. So the people torturing you or keeping you awake for days on end were saying, where did you go? Where did you meet the devil? When did he put his hand on your head? Was his hand cold? What did he look like? And they were looking for answers to questions that they already thought they knew the answers to. But also because the way small villages work and the way that gossip turns around, everyone knew what it would be that you would answer to being a witch to. So as a result, these sorts of stories came about. Once that confession had occurred, after the first wave of witchcraft accusations, things got so out of hand that the Privy Council in Scotland was a sort of like the cabinet, the cabinet for King James and the subsequent kings. The Privy Council said, you cannot have a witchcraft trial without a commission from us. So you have to come to us and you have to explain what proof you've got that this person's a witch before we will grant you an opportunity to try this person. So they would usually go there and they'd say, here we are, we've written down her confession, so she says she's a witch, you can have your commission. So either before that, but most of the time after that, they would go back and in preparation for a trial, they would say, well, what evidence can we get? And this is where one of the most terrible parts of the witchcraft trials comes in: the expert witness who is led at trial, the witch pricker. In England, he was known as the Witchfinder General. In Scotland, we had our own witchfinders, much, in fact, more busy than the Witchfinder General, who only worked for a very short period of time but was very good at his own PR and described himself as the Witchfinder General. But in Scotland, we had a number of witch prickers, including a man called John Kincaid.
So the witch pricker is a really, really interesting pivotal character, because without the witch pricker, it doesn't proceed. Okay, the whole case would fall apart. So the witch pricker comes into town, and he, because it was always men, except for one notable exception I'll tell you about, would come into town and people would be in fear, because once the witch pricker got his hands on you, it was really big trouble. So they'd bring them in, they'd shave them, they'd examine their bodies, and they'd look for the witch's mark upon the accused body. And the witch pricker would use a bodkin. So they were also known as witch broaders in Scotland. And what they'd do is they would use a bodkin, which is a needle, or sometimes a thin knife, and they would jab at wherever they thought there was a mark. So there might be a birthmark, there might be a scar, there might be what we think of now as a skin tag. There'd be some sort of mark or blemish. Now, these were usually, supposedly, hidden in the private areas of the accused. Now, in England, that seemed to be more like the genital area. In Scotland, it wasn't always as bad as that. So sometimes it could be sort of in your oxter under your arm. It could be sort of like maybe in your collarbone or something like that, but somewhere that would normally be hidden by your clothes. And this mark, James wrote in Demonology, was made by the devil that could either not feel pain or always felt pain. It's a little bit unclear, but it was a mark that the devil had left on you that you always knew the devil owned you because that mark was there. So the pricker was looking for that mark. They'd find the mark, they'd jab it with the pointy item, and it would bleed. Or maybe it wouldn't bleed. And either way, that would prove that it was the witch's mark. And once that had been found, that plus the confession equaled guilty. Okay, so while at the same time you've got the witch pricker doing that job, they're obviously keeping the person sleep deprived. They're possibly, in the earlier versions of the witch trials, they're actually physically torturing them. So those things would come together quite quickly and they'd feel, okay, I'm going to have to confess because this needs to stop. So the most famous witch pricker in Scotland was John Kincaid. There's stories about him in various different communities. He went down to Newcastle as well, but mostly his work was in Scotland. There are stories of him being in Newbury and Fife, because as I mentioned before, Fife is quite a hotbed of witch accusations. And he came into town, and the thing about the witch pricker was he always got paid, okay? So you paid the witch pricker because if you didn't pay him, guess what? Maybe you would be accused of being a witch too, and that's why you didn't want to pay the witch pricker. So he always got his money, and he got paid very handsomely. So there's different figures that they were paid at different points, but they got paid well, and they were kind of like a celebrity. They swept into town, and they did this job, and that meant that the accusation could then go forward to it being a court case. They're all male except for one person called Christian Cadell, who it's thought maybe saw John Kincaid in Newbury, and that she then decided, well, I'm going to get in on this action. And she started being a witch pricker and disguised herself as a man. And people seem to believe that she was a man, or maybe they didn't think she was a man, but they were scared of her because she was a witch pricker. So they just went with what she said in a kind of an emperor's new clothes kind of a way. But eventually she was caught out, and she was actually transported to Barbados. Well, she was supposed to get on a ship that was going to Barbados, but at that point, all records just disappeared of her. So we don't know whether she made it there, if she was killed on the ship, if she was killed before she got on the ship. We don't know, but certainly she was eventually caught for lying about what she could see when she witch pricked people.
And she also put to death a lot of people, didn't she? I mean, she wasn't just one or two and then she got away with it. She actually made a really good living out of it.
Yeah, she did. I mean, they all did. So did Kincaid. You know, once you had found the mark, you know, whatever that mark was, that person was then going to be executed. So they were instrumental, literally, in lots of accused witches' deaths.
People watching that, the people watching that were going to report back would be amazed at the witch who seemingly would have these big bodkins pressed into their body, and then when they took them out, they showed no pain, they showed nothing at all, and it was nothing more than a parlour trick.
Scotland, despite being very Protestant, very churchy, also believed really strongly in magic. And we had a whole industry of what were called service magicians or charmers. And that would be where, like, maybe your washing had been stolen from your line, or you couldn't find an item of jewellery, or there was an illness in your family that just wasn't clearing up. You would go to them and they would give you a spell or a charm, or they'd give you, you know, some sort of tincture that they'd made. And that wasn't seen as being problematic. That wasn't like a witch, because they were not getting their power from the devil. You know, and you're thinking in sort of pre-NHS days, you needed somebody that could help with these things, but they actually generally weren't accused. And if they were accused, it was because something else had happened and they happened to also do that. So it was a really interesting time. And before the idea of witches got super popular, we believed very strongly in Scotland in fairies. And I don't mean like the Disney version of fairies, and this is a very striking image to me. Fairies in Scotland were believed to often be as big just about as a full-grown adult. And they were, every year, about 10% of them were supposedly swept down to hell. And these were people that hadn't quite made it into heaven, and they weren't alive and they weren't dead, and they would do things like they'd meddle in people's lives. So like a baby might disappear and be replaced by a changeling. So that, you know, there's a really interesting thread of that story in Scotland. So not long before the witches became popular, we very much had this kind of magical approach to life. And it's one of the reasons why there weren't so many accusations in the Highlands and the islands and in Ireland, because they still had a much stronger connection with the kind of the veil, the thinness of the veil in places, that meant that they didn't believe in quite the same way in witches as the rest of Scotland did, which is why often accusations are clustered maybe more in the lowlands and around Edinburgh, particularly because that was the seat of power, and then up the east coast. So Fife in particular was really very involved in witch trials. That's where I'm from. And that's because they'd kind of moved slightly away from that more magical reading of life.
Amidst all this darkness and horror, there's cause for real celebration. How to Kill a Witch isn't just a meticulously researched, gripping book. It's a testament to the dedication, passion and sharp insight of Claire Mitchell KC and Zoe Venditozzi. Beyond the pages, their work continues through the Witches of Scotland podcast series, where they bring to life and explore untold stories of not just Scotland, but other accusations around the world, and keep the conversation about justice and remembrance firmly alive. And their efforts haven't just stayed in the realm of scholarship and storytelling. In a landmark moment in International Women's Day 2022, their campaigning helped secure a formal apology from First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish Government, acknowledging the egregious historic injustice suffered by nearly 4,000 men and women accused of witchcraft. It was a powerful, long overdue recognition. A moment in history, activism and compassion came together in a profoundly public way. This is work that doesn't just recount the past. It reshapes how we remember it, honours those who were silenced, and reminds us of the ongoing importance of fairness, empathy and courage in our own time.
We certainly were not the first to do it. There are great academics that have gone ahead of us that have written about it and have tried to highlight this to people and written great academic works. So we stand on the shoulders of giants. What we did for the podcast was we just got as many people on it that were experts as possible and asked what the witchcraft trials were about. And that way we learned. And I think what happened was we just built a community of other interested people along with us. And that community felt the same passion that we did, that we shouldn't forget these people throughout time and that we should continue to remember them in history.
Yeah, that was an International Women's Day in 2022. So there was some legal framework that they were talking about doing, which was about laws against misogyny. And the point that Nicola Sturgeon made was that, you know, the misogyny that exists today didn't come out of nowhere and that we can trace it back many, many hundreds of years. And one of the things that's a very strong and potent symbol of that is what happened during the witch trials, because it was overwhelmingly women that were accused and found guilty, and that the whole structure was about women being weaker. So that was great that the apology was given then, because it meant that we were sort of on the road to getting our three different aims recognised.
It's striking and a little absurd how some of the same dynamics play out today. Across the US, accusations of witchcraft are sometimes hurled at political opponents, often with no evidence at all, amplified purely by social media. And yet, even without substance, these claims can still sway public opinion, showing that the power of fear, suspicion and spectacle hasn't disappeared. It's just found a new platform.
We work with a colleague called Leo Igwe, who runs an organisation across several countries in Africa called Advocacy for Alleged Witches. And what he does is he intervenes, and the people he works with intervene in current modern day accusations of mostly women again, but also men, but it tends to be older people that maybe don't have the support of a family, they don't have money. And very similar to what happened in Scotland, something bad happens. The belief structure says, oh, this has been caused by bad forces, you know, a version of the devil. And then people are banished, and sometimes they disappear, and sometimes they're hurt and occasionally killed. So we know that's happening. It's also happening in some parts of China and India, some parts of South America. And as you've already mentioned, in America itself, North America, which at first you would have thought maybe 2 years ago, you might have thought, come on, that's just ridiculous. However, during the election run for Donald Trump that just happened, that J.D. Vance repeated the words of a pastor who accused Kamala Harris of being involved with witchcraft and with, sort of devil worshipping and using bad magic to get what she wanted.
It's equally.
I don't know if you know this, and I don't know if you're going to believe me when I tell you this, but what's happening right now in America is witchcraft's trying to take this country over. It's witchcraft. It's trying to take America back over. And I want to tell you something else. I am not being political, but I don't see how President Trump bears up under it. He's as strong as I have ever seen a man be. But here's what the Holy Spirit said to me last night, and here's what he said for me to tell you. He said, tell the church that so far Trump has been dealing with Ahab, but Jezebel's fixing to step out from the shadows. That's what the Lord said to me.
She can look presidential, and we'll go to this later. That's the seduction of what I would say is witchcraft. That's the manipulation of imagery that creates an impression contrary to the truth, but it seduces you into seeing it. So that spirit, that occult spirit, I believe, is operating on her and through her.
Yeah.
We know there are various pastors in parts of America that are making money by saying to people, oh, give to my church, we can keep you safe from witchcraft, we can keep you safe from the devil. And things are very, very heightened, and it's just like it was in Scotland. Things go wrong. We're fearful because, there's problems with money. There's the cost of living crisis. There's a problem with climate change. People are constantly fearing that war might break out, in different places. People are scared of Russia. People are scared of, what's happening in various parts of the world. So people then look for somebody to blame, and we can see in Britain, people that have been blamed most recently tend to be immigrants. So we look and we say, oh, these people are dangerous people. Now, you might be listening to this and you might think, well, that's ridiculous. How could that be linked to witchcraft? It doesn't take much. Okay, so we know that the book that Margaret Atwood wrote, The Handmaid's Tale, she talked about every single thing that's in that book. And this book was written in the 80s. Every single thing that's written in that book had happened in Western society. Okay, so this idea of swinging back to a very strict, controlling, fascist, super patriarchal society, all those things had happened. We hope that this doesn't happen, but we don't think it takes that much of a leap from where we are now for things like that to happen. Roe versus Wade was rolled back. Women's rights are being rolled back on abortion and on general reproductive medicine. This is the pivotal point where women are being blamed for some of the ills of society. So we need to really watch, and that's why we think our book is important.
The more you look at it, the clearer it becomes that the combination of fear, suspicion, and targeted accusations hasn't really changed over time. Even today, we see the same patterns: misogynistic attitudes from those who wield the authority of church, state, or financial power, subtly or sometimes overtly eroding women's rights, limiting their influence, and demeaning their contributions. But stepping back into the past, one question looms large. After centuries, persecution and death, what evidence remains of where these women were laid to rest? What traces, if any, still exist on the ground nearly 500 years after the trials?
I think the first place that springs to mind for me is where Claire and I first went to that made, for me personally, the story much more real. And that was way back at the beginning, I think before we even launched the podcast, maybe, Claire, in 2020, or we just started. And Claire was asked in her role with Witches Scotland, but more importantly, I think probably her role as King's Counsel, was asked to come down when some memorials had been unveiled down in Fife in Curus, because there was a woman there called Lilias Adey who'd been accused of being a witch. And her story is fascinating for the biggest reason of her story being fascinating is because she was actually buried And normally that didn't happen. So normally somebody would be found guilty of being a witch. They would strangle her or hang her or him, and then they would burn the body and just dispose of the ashes. But in this case, what happened with Lilius, who was an older woman in the village and a bit of a loner and a little bit odd and sort of viewed as being a bit odd, she was accused and brought in and questioned, and she confessed. But before they could take her to trial and find her guilty, she died. So she died in custody after she'd confessed to being a witch. So that left them with a bit of an issue. What do we do with her body? Because one of the fascinating aspects of the witch trials was a belief that you could be working for the devil as a witch and you could be killed, but the devil could then reanimate your body, what they called a revenant. They could reveneer, which would mean that they could come back to life, maybe kind of an early version of what we think of now as zombies, and keep wreaking havoc on the populace. So that's one of the reasons why they burned the bodies. It wasn't just to stop them from going to heaven. It wasn't just to obliterate them off the face of the earth. They actually had a kind of a functionality to it, which was to stop them causing more trouble in death. So Lilius AD, they couldn't do that because they hadn't found her guilty. So what the minister decided to do was to put her in basically a big coffin, big box, drag it out to the shoreline at Torryburn and bury it with a massive big bit of stone on top of it to keep her in. And there's an idea in Scottish mythology that the devil can't cross running water. So they buried her on the water there, so that sometimes when you go there, you can still see the big stone that's on top of it when the tide is out. And then when the tide is in, it's covered up. And poor Lilius AD, that's what they did with her body. Now that would be one thing on its own, which would be fascinating. But she was actually then grave robbed in the 1800s, at the time when Victorians wanted to collect items, including skulls for phrenology. And her skull was stolen, and some of her bones, and some of the wood of the box that she was actually caught in, and then they put the stone down. So her skull ended up being on show in one of the, what were they called, Claire? They weren't the World's Fair,
the
were
Great
they?
Exhibition. The Great Exhibition.
So it was like the British version of the World Fairs and that they had in America. So her skull went on show and then disappeared. But even more fascinatingly than that, in the early days of photography, her bones, including her skull, were photographed with people that were linked to the University of St Andrews. So we know what her skull looked like. And then you fast forward to maybe eight or so years ago in Dundee. So there, in their forensic identification work, they were able to then take the photographs of the skull and use scientific methodology to show what Lilius AD probably looked like. So if your listeners go online and they look up Lilius AD, Witch of Scotland, they will find an artistic idea of what Lilius looked like. And they were able to prove with that Lilius was a bit of an odd bod. She was very tall for a woman of that age. She lived to be quite old at that point. We know that she lived on her own. She also was quite buck-toothed, and she probably is more with what our stereotype of what a Scottish witch might have looked like, you know? So that's what happened with Lilius. And I think it's fascinating because if you take a walk along the shoreline there at Torryburn and you know where you're looking, and there's now memorials there so you can see the bits that point out towards it. You can see the stone, and under the stone is what's left of Lilius's body, because some of her bones are likely to still be in there. They didn't take her entire corpse. So they took some of her skeleton, but not all of it. And so poor Lilius AD is still out there. And I think that's the only provable body of somebody that had been accused of being a witch is in Scotland, because, as we say, normally they burn the bodies and got rid of the ashes.
The other examples of places in Scotland that your listeners might find interesting, two places spring to mind. First of all, where the whole thing kicked off was North Berwick. Now, James VI of Scotland, the person who wrote Demonology, the person who provided the sort of catalyst for the real witchcraft trials to take hold in Scotland, he brought his young wife back from Denmark, Anne, and he believed that Anne was being stopped from coming to Scotland by bad weather, and the return trip was bedevilled, quite literally bedevilled, as he thought, by the devil trying to stop him bringing his wife back, to stop them having a family and to create havoc with God's envoy in earth. So he believed that there were weather witches in North Berwick and that they had done magic in order to try and stop him coming back, and created these storms at sea. Zoe and I were there very recently doing a TV show, but outside the bird centre there is the original old kirk where it was said that the women met with the devil and they planned to ensure the downfall of King James VI of Scotland and the First of England. And there are very detailed confessions from women taken and recreated in a document that was written at the time called News from Scotland, which sets out in incredible detail into these supposed meetings, all fantasy, of course, from people who had been tortured for a long time, but people saying that they came to North Berwick in sieves, they had arrived late, and the devil as a penance had made them kiss him on his bottom, and that they sang and they danced, and they even record the words of the song that they would sing, "Come or you go, come or you may," Come or being a sort of a woman or a friend or a godmother. And it was said that 200 witches danced there. So people can still go to the old kirk outside the bird centre in North Berwick and see where this was alleged to have happened. So that's one really sort of the start of the witchcraft trials. At the other end of the spectrum was the really last recorded witchcraft trial, and the last woman that was said was killed as a witch, and that was Janet Horn of Dornoch. And North Berwick is right down the south of the country, and Dornoch's right up the top. So you've got the start of the witchcraft trials in North Berwick at the bottom, end of the witchcraft trials at the top. And this was a poor woman who lived with her daughter, and it is believed that her daughter has what we would now call in the modern day limb differences. She had some kind of problem with her limbs, such that the story was made up that she and her daughter had both been witches, and that the devil had changed the daughter into an animal with hooves, and that Janet Horn had ridden her daughter around. That this was really against a terribly, terribly sad background. And by the time that Janet Horn had been accused as a witch and convicted, she had very much lost her mind, because she was recorded as being taken to her own funeral pyre and to be happily warming her hands and asking what was going on. She didn't really understand. What is good is that it's not reported that her daughter was executed, so we really hope that someone saw sense and she was not executed. But if you go up to Dornoch just now, inside someone's private front garden, there is a stone, perhaps the size of a small memorial stone, and it just says on it 1727, or I think maybe it says 1722, where it was said that Janet Horn was executed. So the person has a small picket fence around their garden, but a lot of people hang over the garden gate and photograph this particular stone that was put down. Those are two places in Scotland that have a really strong connection with the witchcraft trials, and they are doing more now, I think, to promote that story, because as we discussed before with Salem, when people realised that they'd done a grievous wrong, and in Salem, in comparison to the thousands of people killed in Scotland, in Salem 19 people were executed as witches. 19, not thousands. But because they realised that they'd done a terrible thing, that had been a miscarriage of justice, they immediately tried to put things right. Nothing's ever been put right in Scotland. We haven't had a reckoning with what happened. And it's only now that so many people agree with what Zoe and I have been saying, and the podcast's now been going 5 years, would you believe it, that more and more people around the country are setting up their own memorials, which is so fantastic. So there are other memorials. There's a memorial in Edinburgh, in Kirkstofan. There's a memorial event we're going to in Pennycook soon. There's a memorial in Forfar. So around the country in Scotland, if you put in witch memorials, there have been a really gratifying number of local groups that have got the idea together to check out who was accused in their area, and to write the names of all the women that were executed as witches. And it's very sad and it's very poignant. If you look for the Witches' Memorial in Forfar, you'll find it. It's not a big place.
Across Scotland, the hills, glens and lonely roads carry stories beneath every footstep. Stories of fear, courage and lives lived under extraordinary pressure. From that landscape, and from a simple curiosity about the women who were accused, a campaign has grown, one that honours their memory and transforms history into something tangible, beautiful and lasting. The new Witches of Scotland tartan is a perfect example. Every thread tells a story, weaving together the past, the campaign's aims, and a commitment to remembrance and understanding.
I went to the V&A in Dundee when they had their tartan exhibition opening night. It was amazing. People were walking around in tartans. It wasn't just kilts. People had sashes, they had hats, they had shoes, they had belts, everything that you could think of clothes-wise. And people were busy telling the stories of, this is this tartan, this is what this tartan means. And I suddenly thought, wouldn't it be great if we could design a tartan that had that history in it, that had symbolism in it, that had colours in it that meant something connected with it. And so Zoe and I contacted the director of the V&A, Leonie Bell, and she put us in the direction of the fabulous Claire Campbell at Prickly Thistle, who single-handedly herself brought tartan making back to the Highlands of Scotland in 2018. And she produced for us a tartan design which we absolutely fell in love with, which is symbolic in terms of the colours used, the number of threads used, and tells the story of the women of Scotland. So we started a Kickstarter hoping that we would get £5,000 worth of sales, and if we did, we'd be able to take that £5,000 and give it to Claire and say, okay, make us some tartan. On the first day that we had the tartan available, it sold £70,000 worth of tartan, and we were quite alarmed, quite frankly. We were quite scared, and we spoke to Claire, who says, don't panic, I will look and I will tell you how much more that I can make. And she told us I can make another £70,000 worth of tartan. So we put that on, and within a further 48 hours it had sold out. The threads are made in Scotland. The tartan is made by a group of women, 15 women and 1 man in Scotland, making authentic tartan the way it's always been for centuries. And people can buy it, they can wear it, and they can tell the story of the Witches of Scotland. And it's clearly taken off, because we've had interest and contact from people all over the world wanting this tartan.
I mean, really, it's been amazing, the fact that people are so interested. And we've now got a waiting list of, I think, 5,000 people that want items. And so it means a great deal to us, because not only are we helping Prickly Thistle to have business that's coming their way, so that's employing women in the Highlands, and it means that it's being made in the traditional way up there. They also make things in zero waste, so we know that it's really good for the environment. So it's really, really thoughtful, their process. But it also means that if people all over the world are wearing the tartan, that's going to keep the conversation going. So it means that if I go to an event and I've got a dress on made of the tartan, or somebody goes to a wedding and they've got their kilt made of the tartan, people are going to say, oh, what clan's that from? And then they can tell the story of the Witches of Scotland, and that means that story goes on, and it's a real, proper, meaningful, living memorial, because these women and men will be remembered, and it means that they'll be remembered differently. So not just squared away as witches that were executed and their ashes were disposed of. These are people that were accused of something that was wrong. It was a miscarriage of justice. And it's something that was bad in Scotland's history that we need to know about and learn from, so that we do better.
A word of warning for listeners. If you're now rushing to Google to see where you can buy a Witches of Scotland tartan souvenir or more, please be aware that you can only purchase the genuine article via the witchesofscotland.com website. Tartan that is handmade in Scotland the traditional way. Sadly, there have already been numerous reports of charlatans selling very poor, unlicensed copies around the globe, disappointing many people who thought they were supporting the campaign. The irony of men still not having scruples, and the subject of witches continues to this day. As always, I do have one final question. I'd love one of you to answer it. Of all the things I could have asked you about the Witches of Scotland, the work you've done and the work as it's progressing, what should I have asked you?
Good question. You've actually been very thorough. What should you have asked us? I tell you what you should have asked us, because so many people have asked us. People continually have said, "Are you witches?" And that's a very short answer for both of us. No.
No.
So we are very much supported, in fact, by people who identify as modern day witches, because there are hundreds of thousands, millions of people who identify as modern day witches who do things like they do spells, and they do mindfulness and meditation and things that are described as modern day witchcraft. We are very clear that the people that we are talking about are those people who are executed as witches under the Witchcraft Act, which means that they had formed a pact with the devil to do evil in society. So when we talk about pardoning witches and we talk about witchcraft and that we don't believe in witchcraft, that is what we are talking about. We're more than happy that people that in the modern day identify as witches and do their, meditation practices or all those sorts of things. We're more than happy with that. We don't want any pardons for them. They haven't done anything wrong. That's not what witchcraft means in the modern day. So I suppose the easy question that you could have asked was, "Are you witches?" And the answer is no.
My thanks to Claire and Zoe for taking the time and sharing such a fascinating insight into their book, How to Kill a Witch, which of course is available in all good bookstores and online. If you'd like to know more about them or listen to their podcast, please go to their website, witchesofscotland.com. If you're curious to know if your Scottish ancestors were ever accused of being a witch, please check out the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft at witches.hca.ed.ac.uk. Don't worry, that link will be in the show notes. So next time you walk through Scotland's hills and glens, or pitch a tent beside a quiet loch, it's easy to feel the peace and beauty of the landscape. But if you listen closely, if you pause and let the winds speak, you might hear the echoes of the past, the footsteps, the voices, the lives that were shaped by fear, suspicion, and injustice. And while the centuries have passed, some attitudes stubbornly remain. Women around the world are still fighting to be heard, believed, and respected, too often silenced by gossip, misogyny, and the patriarchal structures of society. Yet there is hope. Just as the land endures, so does the courage, resilience, and creativity of those determined to honour history, challenge injustice, and ensure that voices once ignored are finally recognised. Every walk, every conversation, every story shared is a step towards understanding, and a reminder that while the past shapes us, it doesn't have to define us. Until next time, folks, take care out there while you walk through history beneath your feet. And bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To hear or see more from our extensive free library, please visit theoutdoorstation.co.uk.